See how he may be remembered. Ron Brownstein joins us now. He's a CNN senior political analyst and senior editor at The Atlantic. Ron, just listening to Christiane's report, I mean, it really does take one back. I mean, I was a kid during this time. I wasn't paying that much attention to what was going on. But it's interesting to hear President Carter in his interview with Christiane saying that what they were able to accomplish, that deal with Israel and Egypt, was, he believed, more difficult than the situation between Israel and the Palestinians.
Yeah, you know, it really is interesting to go back there. And if you look at that, as you say, period at Camp David as kind of the highlight of the Carter presidency, one that Anderson, I think, showed his greatest strengths. I mean, he had a tremendous intellect, a kind of an engineer's desire and determination to take apart problems and reassemble them. And he had a pretty good personal touch behind closed doors. Fast forward 1 year later, and he spends another 10 days at Camp David, leading to the speech in 1979, the Crisis of Confidence speech that is often called the Malaise speech, which was kind of the low point of his presidency. And it really kind of shows you the kind of the poles of the Carter experience. He had some important accomplishments, but ultimately he lost the confidence of the country and lost that second term in a resounding vote. And he was an important figure in the Democratic Party. He was an important figure in kind of knitting together American society again after all the tumult and turmoil of the 60s, but he was a transitional figure in the Democratic Party and could not really build a coalition that lasted both either in Congress or in the electorate.
I mean, his candidacy was unlikely to begin with. I mean, he had been in the Navy. He had served honorably in the Navy and nuclear submarines. His father had died. He went back to take over the family business, which was peanut farming. I think it was a school board. He first got elected to state senator. He became governor, obviously. But when he ran for president, I mean, that was a long shot.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a dark horse. I mean, when he was elected governor in 1971 and he took over in 1971 in Georgia, he succeeded Lester Maddox as governor of Georgia, who was, a virulent racist and ardent segregationist. And Carter, in many ways, was the embodiment of the hope of a new South in the post-civil rights era. And I thought, looking back on Carter, he was the first president I covered at all. He was a figure he was an important figure of cultural reconciliation in a lot of ways after the 1960s. He was an ardent, he was a devout Christian evangelical Protestant who embraced rock and roll. He was a Southerner who embraced civil rights. He was as you point out, a Navy veteran who pardoned the Vietnam draft resistors. He was someone in a marriage that to all the world looked like a very traditional union, but accepted and celebrated a more assertive role for women. And in all these ways, I thought he sort of cemented a lot of the cultural change that came through in the 60s. But if he was a figure of cultural integration, as I said, in some ways, he was a figure of political disintegration. He was presiding over the Democratic coalition that was really starting to come apart at the seams. And the best kind of model of how that, upended his presidency was that many of his legislative achievements attempts were blocked in Congress by conservative Southern Democrats. And then in 1980, he got a challenge in the primary from the left, from Teddy Kennedy, who thought that he moved too far to the center. He pioneered some of the, I think, reforms in the Democratic Party that Bill Clinton completed 15 a dozen years later. But in some ways, he was a man ahead of his time in recognizing the Democratic Party had to change. He just couldn't bring enough of his party along with him, either on the right or the left.
What was it that, I mean, as I said, it was such an unlikely candidacy. It was a long shot. Was it the post-Watergate era that the American people were just tired of the scandal, and he seemed to be a man of virtue, which certainly he lived a great life of virtue. Certainly his post-presidency life exemplifies that. That
was it. I think by far more than anything else. I mean, his slogan in 1976 was a government, we deserve a government as good as the American people. He was someone who his decency just sort of emanated from him. He seemed connected to the times in all the ways that I kind of mentioned. You know, someone who bridged the culture wars of the 60s between younger generations that wanted social change and older generations that Nixon had mobilized against that change in his silent majority. And he was someone who seemed to offered a chance to turn the page after all of that internal strife in the country that culminated in Watergate. But again, in office, as some of the biographers, Kai Bird, John Alter, have pointed out, he got more done than he got credit for. But in many ways, he was there as the Democratic coalition was kind of coming apart. He slowed the movement of Southern evangelicals in some ways toward the Republican Party in 1976. But, you know, Anderson, the birth of the modern religious right is often assumed to have been around Roe v. Wade. That isn't really it. If you talk to the people who were involved, Paul Weyrich, who I interviewed many times before he died, it was when Jimmy Carter in 1978, the IRS under Jimmy Carter, I guess in 77, revoked the tax exemption for racially discriminatory religious schools. And that was Jimmy Carter. I mean, he was someone, and it was the backlash to that led to the moral majority and all of the movement that we saw under Reagan, Southerners toward the GOP, Southern evangelicals toward the GOP. Carter was someone who really kind of embraced the future culturally. Just politically, he had a hard time marshaling enough of a coalition to either build broad popular support or to get his agenda through Congress.
Yeah. Ron Brownstein, I appreciate you joining us on this night. Thank you. We're going to be back with more on the legacy of